Scientists in California have achieved fusion ignition in a lab for the first time in history. Nuclear fusion, which powers the sun and stars, has tantalized scientists for decades as a potential wellspring of abundant, clean energy. We are now one step closer to a greener future. But what if I told you that there was a bigger story hiding under the surface?
A twist?
A twist! That this new era of clean energy is a strategic endeavor of the military-industrial complex, born out of efforts to modernize America's nuclear weapons.
What?
To understand the nuclear fusion breakthrough, I'm going to talk about this summer's blockbuster movie, Oppenheimer. It's about the father of the atomic bomb and the US government's Manhattan Project, which resulted in the most destructive weapon on Earth being dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. The atomic bombs built by Oppenheimer's team used a physical process that produces energy from atoms known as nuclear fission. Despite the horrors of the atomic bomb, theoretical work on even more powerful weapons took place during the Manhattan Project, specifically the hydrogen bomb. Today's warheads are almost all hydrogen bombs, which need fission and fusion. In simple terms, these thermonuclear weapons use an atomic bomb to trigger a fusion explosion. But that could soon change because scientists in California have demonstrated nuclear fusion without fission for the first time in history, potentially paving the way to creating an entirely new class of pure fusion weapons. The breakthrough happened in December of 2022 at the US government's Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. In August, scientists repeated the experiment. So why is the media only covering the story like this?
Today, the Department of Energy announced a momentous achievement in the search for clean, renewable energy, a breakthrough in nuclear fusion.
But basically, it's a giant step towards a clean energy future without dependence on fossil fuels.
If fusion becomes commercial power one day, it would be endless and carbon-free. In other words, it would change human destiny.
Somehow, the bigger story about fusion and its potential for nuclear weapons has gotten lost in all the excitement about clean energy.
So I vaguely remember learning about nuclear fusion and fission in class, but like for the audience that maybe doesn't remember 35 years ago, could you inform why the ignition process? That's the big deal, right?
Yeah, nuclear fusion is the process that powers the sun and the stars. It's basically when two light atomic nuclei combine to form a single heavier one while releasing massive amounts of energy. Now, it's such a big deal that researchers produced this in a lab because fusion ignition yields more energy than it takes to create. If this process can be replicated at an industrial scale, it could one day provide unlimited, clean, safe, affordable energy for the entire world.
Oh, well, that sounds good.
Yeah, or it could possibly give the US military a major nuclear weapons advantage, one that has yet to be disclosed. Until now, pure fusion weapons have only been hypothetical because no devices could substitute a primary fission trigger with non-nuclear components. But that device now exists in California. The machine's giant lasers have now made pure fusion weapons scientifically feasible for the first time. This is the real story.
Okay. I see where you're going with this, I think. But it feels like there's a lot of speculation possibly going on here. Do you have any evidence to support these claims?
Of course I do.
Mrs. Journalist?
Of course. First of all, the home of this experiment is the National Ignition Facility at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, which is one of the US Department of Energy's premier nuclear weapons research sites. Reporters at the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists point out that the folks who succeeded in attaining ignition and self-sustained fusion were not part of the Department of Energy's fusion energy program. Instead, they work for the National Nuclear Security Administration, which manages our nation's nuclear weapons stockpile. This facility is incredibly important to the US military because in 1992, Washington imposed a moratorium on nuclear explosives testing. 1 year later, the Clinton administration directed the Department of Energy to create a stockpile stewardship program to compensate for the effects of the comprehensive testing ban and protect the country's ability to resume nuclear tests anytime. In 2020, President Trump discussed doing exactly that. And then there's this from the very people involved in the nuclear fusion experiment.
The ignition work we're doing is for stockpile stewardship, right? Our thermonuclear weapons have fusion ignition that takes place in our weapons. And so studying fusion ignition is something we do to support the stockpile stewardship program.
This achievement will advance our national security in at least 3 ways. First, it will lead to laboratory experiments that help NNSA defense programs continue to maintain confidence in our deterrent without nuclear explosive testing. Second, it underpins the credibility of our deterrent by demonstrating world-leading expertise in weapons-relevant technologies. That is, we know what we're doing.
A press release from the Department of Energy says, quote, "In making this breakthrough, they've opened a new chapter in the Stockpile Stewardship Program. This program is all about the physics of weapons. Solving difficult physics problems, like how to achieve fusion ignition in a lab, which was first theorized over 60 years ago, is an incredible feat. At the end of the day, the people who work on these programs are weapons designers."
So you realize this is kind of like bummer news that you're telling everybody here. I mean, everyone was all hyped up and excited that we're going to get clean energy finally, and finally get off fossil fuels, and, stop polluting the environment, and everything will stop being on fire by next year. Well, that's probably a pipe dream, but do you think that it's possible that, even though it's probably true what you're talking about, them making weapons from this, that eventually we'll get clean energy?
Yeah, I don't want to downplay the energy implications of this technology. It actually could be really amazing, but for now, fusion reactors are really expensive, and the scientists who worked on the experiment say that it'll be decades until we can produce energy this way. And I'll give you the example that happened with the California experiment. The researchers there used a laser to deliver 2.05 megajoules of energy to a fuel capsule that then produced 3.15 megajoules.
1.21 gigawatts!
Whatever, that's super technical. Basically, it's a little bit of a gain. But the reporting isn't accurate. It wasn't a total net surplus because it took 300 times that amount of energy from the grid to fire up the laser that was used to conduct this experiment in the first place.
Oh, well, that's not going to work.
It's definitely not going to work. So we have an incredibly long way to go before we're going to produce energy this way. But yes, one day, fusion may generate 4 times more energy per kilo of fuel than today's nuclear power plants, and nearly 4 million times more energy than burning coal or oil.
Well, is it possible that we got to take this downward road to get to a positive future eventually?
It's possible, but the American Society of Civil Engineers constantly give America's infrastructure poor grades because it's aging. So if we can't even fix our roads, how are we supposed to believe that they're going to dump billions of dollars into this project just to get clean energy? We can't even agree if climate change is real.
So I did just see Oppenheimer recently, a couple weeks ago, and it's interesting that we're bringing this whole thing full circle, because at the end of the movie, he was pulling for arms control. And if we're really just doing this to make nuclear weapons, maybe, where are we with nuclear arms control at this point?
That's a great and very important question. Since the Manhattan Project, at least 9 countries have acquired nuclear weapons. Under President Trump, the US pulled out of several key nuclear non-proliferation agreements, and the Biden administration hasn't rejoined. Because of all this and the war in Ukraine, Russia has now suspended its last nuclear arms treaty with the US. The Science and Security Board at the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists have now set the doomsday clock at 90 seconds to midnight. This is the closest the symbolic ticker has ever been to a global catastrophe since the Bulletin was founded in 1945 by Albert Einstein and scientists who worked on the Manhattan Project.
So the doomsday clock is closer than ever, and we're going to make more bombs.
Well, we don't know. There's no confirmation that they're making bombs, but they're obviously doing some nuclear experimenting that has to do with weapons. If pure fusion weapons become a reality, it will make nuclear arms control even harder, because pure fusion weapons would be fueled by forms of hydrogen that are easy to secretly acquire, unlike today's warheads, which need plutonium and highly enriched uranium. It's hard to hide industrial activities related to obtaining these current fissile materials.
So if this new generation of nuclear bombs that they're trying to make can be made without plutonium or uranium, doesn't that make it a lot easier for every little random country to make their own nuclear bombs?
Yes, that's exactly the point. It makes it really hard to monitor because these pure fusion bombs would essentially need forms of hydrogen that are easy to acquire, like deuterium, which is basically extracted from seawater. So that makes it very, very easy. Now, these pure fusion bombs, which right now are hypothetical, they are also known as clean bombs. Our current nuclear weapons are called dirty bombs because they produce nuclear fallout, radioactive waste. Pure fusion bombs would not have that nuclear waste. So essentially they're cleaner bombs, but they are super, super deadly. And as you just mentioned, a little bit easier to acquire materials to make. That is assuming that other countries would have these devices that we now have with these super powerful lasers to create this fusion reaction in the first place. Currently, the watchdogs of the world that go into places like Iran and check on their the enrichment levels of their uranium can say, hey, we've set a limit. You can't produce any enriched uranium at levels beyond whatever, 3%. It would be really hard to watch people because they could essentially just be extracting seawater to get this deuterium. The last time the US government made history with its nuclear abilities, it resulted in mass civilian casualties and a global nuclear arms race that hasn't stopped. America is still the only country that has ever deployed nuclear weapons on humans. So with the latest nuclear fusion breakthrough, we have to ask, is the world really safer?
And I don't think we have to worry about it because I've heard that the aliens have actually disabled most of our nuclear weapons like years ago.
I mean, that's awesome. I hope that happened. Maybe they can come down here and like help us out on Earth.
But it wasn't for benevolent reasons.
Oh, really? How do you know this?
That's another story for another day. We're gonna do that later.
Be sure to tune in to Taboo News Tuesday next week for another discussion on topics that are rarely part of public discourse. And be sure to subscribe to my channel so you never miss an episode. For my next taboo topic, click here. Thanks for watching. I'm Brigida.
That's a wrap.